Hi guys, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Let's drift back to the 14th century, when the walls were stone cold, the windows were just glorified holes, and insulation was something you whispered to your thatch and hoped for the best. Picture it. A small timber-framed cottage crouched under a grey English sky, smoke threading lazily from the hole in the roof, which honestly did more to let the cold in than the smoke out. Inside, the Smith family, no relation to the modern variety of Smiths armed with thermostats and fleece blankets, were gathered like sleepy hedgehogs around the hearth. The hearth was the heart, the oven, the radiator, and, occasionally, the family gossip circle. And what a modest fire it was. Not your Yosemite-style roaring blaze. Wood was precious after all. Most families leaned hard on peat, dried cow dung, or anything mildly flammable that wasn't nailed down. Sometimes even the nails were considered. Now, you may ask, perhaps while curling deeper into your memory foam mattress, how in the name of Saint Breur did medieval folks not freeze solid overnight? First, wool. Layers of it. So much wool. Undyed, untreated, and often very much unwashed. They wore woolen tunics, woolen hose, woolen cloaks. Think of it less as dressing and more as constructing a personal thatched cottage from sheep. Wool traps air, is surprisingly warm even when damp, and is remarkably flammable, which made living near an open hearth equal parts snug and suspenseful. Next, straw. Not just for donkeys and dramatic exits in romantic comedies. Fresh straw was strewn over earthen floors to create what they charmingly called rush floors. Every few days, they'd toss more straw on top, not remove the old of course, creating a layered effect best described as rustic lasagna. Soft underfoot and modestly insulating, but also, shall we say, alive. Medieval homes were known to include entire microscopic civilizations in their floorboards, but they did keep your toes from touching cold stone directly. Low expectations were their own kind of comfort. And then there was bed sharing. Not just a marriage thing. Whole families, siblings, visiting travelers, and even livestock sometimes co-slept, not for warmth of heart, but warmth of body. The family bed became a human burrito of necessity. Little Alfric and baby Edith squeezed between parents and a snoring uncle, all under a mountain of coarse wool and perhaps last week's cloak. If you ever woke up with a goat on your feet and your cousin drooling on your collarbone, you were probably just alive in 1381. Let's not forget the curtained, canopied bed, a statement piece, if you could afford one. Rich folks had beds with heavy hangings designed less for privacy and more for heat retention. Beds in these grand households were like tiny fortresses against drafts, often complete with embroidered virtue quotes, endless feather mattresses, and the occasional monkish visitor with a lute. For lighting, they relied on firelight, tallow candles, and rushlights. Dried reeds soaked in animal fat, which sounds romantic until you realize it smelled like a campfire kissed a cheese shop. These flickering lights cast gentle shadows and were known to make even the wrinkliest peasants look a little bit ethereal. And for the record, Brother Oswin usually remembered to feed the cat. The scriptorium cat, Mabel, was as sacred as the illuminated manuscripts she poured across. She kept the mice away from the monk's precious parchments and occasionally knocked over an inkwell just for the drama. So that's how they managed it. Layers of sheep, heaps of straw, a fireplace that doubled as evening entertainment, and the constant shared body heat of several reluctant relatives. It may not sound luxurious, but it did the job, just like a lullaby scribbled in Middle English. And now, lovely listener, if you're still with me, press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. When winter's breath crept in through the timbers, medieval families didn't have the luxury of casually adjusting a thermostat or slipping into fleece pajamas with questionable logos. No, they had wool, and an overwhelmingly optimistic relationship with it. To understand how they kept warm, one must first picture the setting. A one-room cottage with thick stone walls and a roof held together by hope, thatch and birds that occasionally moved in rent-free. Windows, if they existed at all, were more decorative than functional. Small, thin slits glazed in horn or oiled cloth. Think less French doors, more prison glam. Inside the hearth was the protagonist, glowing, smoking, forever sizzling with something unidentifiable. It sat squarely in the middle like a village gossip, always surrounded. This was less about architectural feng shui and more about survival. Every activity orbited that hearth, cooking, storytelling, drying socks that would never fully dry. But even with a fire blazing, heat was more of a suggestion than a condition. So medieval folks turned to wool, layers of it, wool tunics, wool hooded cloaks, underthings made of coarser wool than you'd wish upon your least favorite relative. Itchy, indisputably, but warm, relatively. It was nature's original insulation package deal, often accompanied by the subtle scent of sheep and hand-milled soap, if you were lucky. Children typically wore miniature versions of adult clothing, and even toddlers toddled around wrapped like woolly burritos. Infants, meanwhile, were frequently swaddled into near immobility and parked near the heat, resembling lumpy loaves of bread waiting to rise. Now, if you're wondering, did they just wear their daytime clothes to bed? Oh heavens no, they wore their daytime clothes plus anything else they weren't actively using as a curtain or placemat. Nightshirts existed, yes, but for those who couldn't afford multiple garments, a good woolen outer tunic became a nighttime cuddle buddy. 2 birds, 1 sheep. The beds themselves were a farrago of straw, feathers, if you ranked high enough in the medieval snuggle hierarchy, and whatever fabric could be stitched or stolen into something resembling a mattress. Loose straw mattresses were common. Their crinkly rustle not ideal for stealthy midnight escapes, but helpful for letting your fellow sleepers know you were indeed shifting and should be granted more blanket. Speaking of blankets, woe there. This was the golden age of the counterpane, an early term for whatever sorry excuse for a bed cover could be cobbled together. Old cloaks, tattered linen sheets, felted wool squares, all layered with the desperation of someone who had just seen frost form inside their window. Now, for the bedmate situation. It was customary, nay strategic, to sleep together. Not always romantically, and often not even with anyone you liked. Heat is heat, and in the medieval playbook, the most reliable source of warmth, aside from high-quality wool, was the human body. Thus, families routinely bedded down in clusters, like squirrels in a windy tree. Parents, children, grandparents, a neighbor passing through with really good gossip. They'd all huddle like a warm, snoring lasagna. But let's not forget the foot warmer, a humble yet crucial character in our tale. In some lucky households, or perhaps just those who kept falling asleep with all their toes intact, there might be a heated brick wrapped in cloth or an iron container filled with embers tucked under the foot of the blankets, a medieval hot water bottle without the water, or the bottle. And then, There was the bed curtain, the velvet rope of the peasant knight's club, though typically crafted from coarse linen or wool rather than anything remotely posh. Hung from a wooden frame or from beams above the bed, this curtain served as the final defense against drafts, nosy chickens, and that cousin who snored through his moustache. As midnight faded to murky grey dawn, fires dwindled to soft embers, and somewhere in the straw, an elbow met a toe in territorial dispute. Yet somehow, amid snorts and shivers, people slept. Over time, those huddled beds became places of stories, lullabies, and dreams muffled in woolen sleeves. And so, with the hearth dimmed and the straw bed rustling under layers of patchwork warmth, let's pull our own blanket a bit closer. The fire may wane, but our curiosity still flickers. Next, we'll gently wander into the world of medieval pottage, hearth-cooked stews, and the art of warming your soul one unevenly chopped turnip at a time. On a whispering winter morning in the English countryside, somewhere between the year definitely not warm and, hope you like, frostbite, the medieval family would begin their day with the grace of someone trying not to shatter into icicles. Our quintessential peasant household didn't have central heating, thermostats, or any of those geese-feathered duvets we casually cast aside today when the room hits 22 degrees Celsius. What they had, oh dear dreamer, was ingenuity, discomfort, and a suspicious love affair with wool. Let's step into their timber-framed world, where the walls breathe slightly in the wind, and the thatched roof above you may or may not currently have a family of squirrels in residence. The floor is not so much made of stone as born of it, a surface so cold and unyielding that one might reasonably wonder if the concept of socks had yet been invented out of necessity. To keep the chill at bay, families would begin their defensive strategy at the most basic level, layering fabric like onions wearing other, skinnier onions. Woolen tunics, cloaks, hosen. Imagine long woolen leg snugglers with a built-in may chafe if ambitious, and perhaps even caps indoors. Yes, hats inside. The phrase, keep your head warm, wasn't just grandmotherly myth, it was elemental survival. Heat escapes from the head after all. And medieval folks? They weren't about to let their precious head heat just float off into the icy unknown. Not on their watch. Their primary weapon at night, meanwhile, was the bedding arrangement. Imagine climbing into bed not as the welcoming flop we know today, but as a small act of glory-laced courage. The straw mattress, filled with last season's leftovers, possibly shared with an enthusiastic population of mites, would be laid across a wooden frame, or maybe just directly on the earth if luck had skidded off into the woods that year. And this mattress, as delightfully crisp as a December carrot, would be smothered in layers and layers of hand-woven wool blankets. The kinds of blankets that didn't drape so much as cling to you like unpaid taxes. Heavy, scratchy, and blessedly insulating. And let's spare a sleepy thought for those little medieval toes. They were often tucked into yet another layer, sheepskin perhaps, or old bits of fabric reused and repurposed beyond recognition. Children might even sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, not due to any affection for sibling elbows, but because warmth was an economy of bodies. The more you added, the less chance you had of freezing into a commemorative family sculpture overnight. Now, firelight. Ah, the glowing heart of the home and the ultimate medieval status symbol. Whether it was a modest hearth in a rural cottage or a grander fireplace in a more cushioned dwelling, the fire wasn't just decorative, it was lifeblood. During the coldest months, the flames would smolder slowly through the night, banks of ashes smothering the worst of their enthusiasm, leaving behind a gentle heat that whispered into the darkness. Waking up to rekindle the flames was often someone's solemn pre-dawn duty, mother, eldest son, or whoever lost the rock, paper, scissors of medieval delegation. To facilitate this, a very simple invention came to the rescue: the fire dog or andiron. These metal stands lifted logs off the base of the hearth, creating circulation and, dare we say it, primitive fire science. Learning to manage the embers wasn't just practical, it became a near-spiritual daily rite, like brewing tea or throwing socks in despair at the laundry basket today. If the home had more than one room, and let's not get too fancy, more might mean just two. Only the main living space would typically be heated. The bedrooms? A charming flirtation with glacial survival. But before you shed tears for medieval sons and daughters shivering under snoring parents' feet, know this: even the upper crust rarely had the whole house heated. Cold was democratic. It came for serfs and lords alike, though one had more wool to yell into than the other. And so, our family of old curled up beneath woolen folds, the fire crackling low, and the straw mattress resettling beneath their sleepy frames. The night outside might howl and snap with frost, but indoors, no matter how humble the walls, the battle against winter was being won, one shared blanket and one snore at a time. Perhaps tomorrow we'll peek into what they wore. To bed, and why sometimes getting undressed for sleep was entirely optional. Now, once you've layered your medieval self in as many tunics as you can wiggle into, wedged your feet into leather turn shoes stuffed with wool, and huddled under a roof that might or might not keep out the weather, depending on how spirited the last storm was, it's time to face one of the greatest discomforts of the Dark Ages: the floor. Specifically, the art, and yes, it was an art, of building a warm and livable floor. Contrary to what romanticized tapestry ads might suggest, most medieval homes did not feature gleaming stone floors you'd want to slide across in socks, if your household could even afford stone, or knew a mason less sassy than the weather. You might have considered it for the kitchen or church vestibule, but for ordinary folk, the prevailing floor substance was, well, dirt. That's right. Good, honest, frequently trampled earth. At first glance, you might think a dirt floor would be rather cold and impolite to your bare toes during an icy January. And you'd be right. It was. Which is why humanity's favorite plant-based insulation began its glorious rise. Straw. Straw. The golden hero of the medieval hearth. Not to be confused with hay, which is food for animals. Straw is the dry stalk left over after reaping grain. Also, not to be confused with the suspiciously crunchy thing in a 21st century smoothie. Medieval straw had a nobler calling: floor coverage. Every few weeks, or more often, depending on how much soup had been spilled, or how many chickens had been accidentally locked in overnight, families would trudge out with great armfuls of straw and lay down a fresh, insulating layer. This wasn't just for coziness. It also had a surprising aromatic effect. See, medieval people weren't unaware of the possibility of unpleasant smells. They had just developed an immunity and a lot of herbs. That brings us to our spicy detail of the hour. Rushes. Rushes were long grasses harvested from riverbanks that were dried and used in much the same way as straw, except with an elegant twist. Many English households, particularly from the 14th century onward, sprinkled a mixture of dried rushes, herbs like lavender, chamomile, rosemary, and sometimes mint, directly onto their floors. This isn't a joke. It was designed to act as a primitive air freshener / mouse deterrent. A cozy, fragrant mulch beneath your feet. Quite possibly the world's first aromatherapeutic carpet. Of course, over the weeks, and let's be honest, sometimes months, the combination shifted from invitingly herbal to a rich blend of old straw, soot, crumbs, beetles, forgotten spoons, and possibly one end of a misplaced turnip, when the layers became too spongy or too suspiciously warm in certain corners. Someone would sweep it all out and start again with a ceremonious whack of new greenery. This organic approach to heating from the ground up had another unexpected benefit. It muffled sound. If you ever thought medieval homes echoed sonorously with Gregorian chants and whispered political schemes, the reality was probably closer to muffled curses and a toddler enthusiastically dropping cheese. Now, as for the slightly fancier folk, those who demanded a little more elegance beneath their feet, there were carpets. Not the thick Turkish numbers you might see in a stately home, rolled out by devoted maids and jeopardized by tea. No, these were more modest woven woolen rugs, often small and reserved for the main room or placed near beds to stop cold toe-induced profanity first thing in the morning. Speaking of morning, the medieval day didn't begin quite as early as you'd think. Without electric lights or a bossy phone alarm, people rose with the sun or a cocky rooster. But in winter, when the floor was stiff with frost and your house smelled faintly of ewe sheep and medieval ambition, well, families stayed in bed as long as they could, emerging only when the fire was stoked and someone, typically the youngest or least liked, had been volunteered to fetch wood barefoot. In this way, the floor of the medieval home, whether it be packed earth, plant-stuffed straw, or herbally enhanced rush, served not just as a walking platform, but as an unlikely participant in the delicate dance of daily survival. It provided smell, insulation, hiding places for toys and rodents, and enough warmth to justify dragging your blanket-wrapped self from bed on the darkest of mornings. And yet, as important as the floor was, there remained one architectural godsend that every villager owed their remaining fingers and cozy dreams to: the central hearth, the flickering core of warmth and shadow, which, incidentally, is where we're headed next. In the hush of winter's grip, when England's wind howled like a gossiping auntie and the air bit with the teeth of January, it was time to turn one's attention to the medieval hearth, both literal and metaphorical. Fire, as you might have guessed, played a starring role in the grand production of Not Freezing to Death Indoors, an unsung domestic drama performed nightly from Northumbria to Normandy. Now, medieval fires weren't the cheery, Instagrammable fireplaces we imagine today, where glowing embers charm their way through hand-carved mantles. No, this was the smoke in your soup, soot on your tunic, and don't mind the occasional spark to the eyeball kind of fire. Yet, to a shivering family huddled in a timber-framed cottage with walls thinner than a friar's excuses during Lent, it was pure heaven. The hearth was usually right in the middle of the main room, nested slightly into the ground, which doubled as both heating system and trip hazard. There were no chimneys early on. Instead, smoke simply meandered where it pleased, though usually upward, drawn by wishful thinking and the occasional hole in the thatch. That's right, your ceiling was your chimney, and no one blinked an eye at breathing in generous lungfuls of seasoning-grade ash with every breath. Respiratory therapy wasn't invented yet, but it was being lovingly suffered through. Still, people grew startlingly crafty when it came to keeping the heat where it belonged. Families in colder regions would sometimes designate a single room as the winter chamber, which sounds posh, but was actually just the room with the least drafts and the fewest vengeful ghosts of freezing livestock. They'd stuff straw in the cracks, pile against walls like human insulation, and even invite a few extra bodies in, chickens, cats, maybe even a neighbor on particularly frosty nights. Heat, after all, didn't care who made it, so long as it stayed. Now, if the fire wasn't enough, and it usually wasn't, wool took center stage. Not merely a fashion statement, but more like a medieval superhero suit. Rough spun, lanolin-laced, slightly itchy, but incredibly effective. Wool cloaks swished like armor against the cold. Children were wrapped in it. Adults tied it round their middles. And yes, dogs often wore little woolly coats too. Not because they were pampered, mind you, but because their body heat was now considered a communal resource. Beneath one's feet, layers of straw and rushes cushioned the stone or packed dirt floors. This was less a medieval design choice and more of a survival tactic. The straw absorbed moisture, prevention against swamp foot, and added a humble but significant layer of cozy. Of course, over time, these layers accumulated, along with droppings, crumbs, and whatever fell from your plate during last week's dinner. Cleaning a floor was not so much tidying up, as it was setting fire to the old rushes and laying new ones, which is both brilliant and refreshingly final. And so, families adapted. They burned peat when firewood was scarce, a slow-burning turf that smelled like a bog in a bar fight, but offered delicious warmth. They knitted together, huddled in sleeping quarters like an epic poem of toes, fingers, and shared exhalations. Beds, shared by necessity, were less of a personal retreat and more of a group effort in not dying of frostbite. Interestingly, warming the bed was a literal business. Enter the humble bed warmer, a brass or ceramic pan filled with hot coals, used to heat the sheets before climbing in. The trick was not to roast your own toes while doing so. These devices, swung about with medieval confidence, were as likely to burn a hole in the straw mattress as they were to provide comfort. So responsibility often fell to the eldest child, old enough to carry the pan, young enough to survive being blamed if the session turned fiery. Yet amidst all these scratchy cloaks, smoky rafters, and fire-branded thigh bones, there bloomed a kind of quiet resilience. Winter evenings slowed the world. Families spun yarn by firelight, told stories long learned and short forgotten, and stirred bubbling pots with spoons worn smooth by generations. Laughter filled the cracks that straw could not. And warmth, where it lived, did not just radiate from flame or fleece, but from the shared human certainty that yes, spring would come again. Just not tonight, but tonight was for drawing closer. As the fire dwindled to a drowsy glow, and a mother adjusted the wool wrap over her sleeping child's tiny feet, another warmth stirred nearby. Wool covered perhaps, but different. You see, the humble bed itself was undergoing a quiet evolution, one that might just make you wish you'd been born 5 centuries earlier, or at least that your mattress had ropes. But more on that soon. Somewhere in the drizzly gloaming of a 14th century November, a thatched cottage leaned politely into the wind, as if it were bracing itself for another politely rude medieval winter. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of peat smoke, wet wool, and determination. This was the season when families turned into engineers, architects, and, though it wasn't on paper, thermal strategists of the highest order. Warming a household without central heating, insulation, or the sort of corporate fleece blanket your aunt gave you last Christmas was a feat not of strength, but of layered ingenuity. Let's begin with the foundation of comfort, straw. Ah yes, straw, the medieval multi-tool. Its resume included mattress stuffing, wall insulation, emergency chicken bedding, and the occasional snack for an opportunistic goat. When it came to warmth, straw was generously strewn across the cottage floor, forming the elusive thresh. You might say it was the carpet of choice for anyone who didn't mind a bit of rustling underfoot. And if you've ever wondered where the phrase "hit the sack" comes from, well, those medieval sacks were full of straw, and hitting one meant bedtime for cold toes. On colder nights, families would bank the hearth fire, carefully piling ashes over embers before bed, creating a smouldering heat that would linger well into morning. It was the slow cooker method of house heating. Practical, smoky, and absolutely guaranteed to make your cloak smell like a very tired bonfire. But the ashes preserved just enough glow that, with a bit of morning coaxing and a lot of blowing that could rival a bard on bagpipe day, the fire could rise again without striking flint. Still, fire alone could not fight the chill that settled like a house guest and refused to leave. That's where wool stepped in, wrapping itself around history like a sheepish hug. Wool cloaks, tunics, hose, and caps were not just garments, they were wearable architecture. Wool, unlike cotton, insulates even when damp, which is handy when your roof might occasionally decide to weep on you during dinner. Fun fact, the wool cap, known delightfully as a coif, was often worn even to bed. Not for fashion, but because ears, like dignity, freeze easily in soggy England. And let us not forget the woolen underwear, which raised the eternal Middle Ages question, warm bottom or itchy bottom. Brave souls chose both. Now, here's where things get cozier and, dare I say, more crowded. Sleeping arrangements were less influenced by personal space and more by survival instincts. The often quoted medieval proverb, "Two in a bed keep the cold out of the head," was not mere rhyme. It was nightly ritual. Families piled into the great bed, also known as the bed, as in the one. Mum, dad, granny, children, and perhaps even the smallest of livestock, all tucked in like a well-sorted drawer of mismatched socks. You may be wondering about privacy. That, dear listener, was considered an optional luxury. The warmth of a shared bed trumped the psychological discomfort of elbowed ribs and someone's knee occupying your back. In colder periods, even guests were encouraged, or happily forced, into the blanket pile. Hospitality, but make it horizontal. Of course, not all beds were created equal. Wealthier households had four-poster beds with curtains, which could block drafts and trap warmth. Picture a medieval tent indoors, with much more snoring and fewer marshmallows. For those slightly less lucky, curtains might be drawn around a straw mattress tucked in a wool nook. Also cozy, if you weren't claustrophobic or prone to sleepy donkey invasions. Even windows, often a luxury themselves, were subjected to winter ingenuity. In the absence of glass, oiled parchment or horn panels would blunt the wind and blur the view like a particularly uninspired fog filter. Tapestries hung on walls did more than show off who married whom in the Third Crusade. They trapped heat, muffled sound, and occasionally gave mice something elegant to live behind. By now, as our fire hums with coals and something vaguely stew-shaped simmers in the pot, you might be wondering how cold it could actually get inside a medieval home. The answer? Very. Especially during the Little Ice Age, when winters regularly overstayed their welcome. Yet, despite the frost-bound fingers and toes, daily life hummed on. bread was baked, sheep were shorn, and people listened to the wind whine through the shutters and thought to themselves, well, at least I'm not naked. And so, in these winter-bound months, every cottage became not just a place to sleep, but a living act of defiance against the cold. The wool was scratchy, the straw poked like a judgmental hedgehog, and the fire was fickle, but together they formed a patchwork of warmth stitched with resilience. Just beyond the smudged window pane, frost begins tracing delicate runes on the world outside. But within, the hearth glows, a mother gently snores, and a child dreams tangled in wool, straw, and peace. In the firelight flicker, a kettle softens its whistle, and tomorrow, the art of warming bread without burning the house will take center stage. As the first frost nibbled at the thatched eaves of a medieval cottage, the family inside huddled together like cabbage leaves in a stew pot, wilted, close, and definitely steaming, but only metaphorically. Warmth, in the year 1327, was not merely a luxury. It was a full-time job with no holidays, dental, or central heating. To understand how our ancestors kept the cold at bay, we must first understand one core medieval principle. Warmth came less from heat, and more from desperately refusing to admit you were cold in the first place. Pride, after all, is surprisingly insulating. Life beneath the timbered beams was defined by layers, on people, on beds, and across windows, which, if glazed at all, admitted light only reluctantly and breezes eagerly. Every person, from toddler to grandmother, was swaddled like a festive meat pie. Wool was the fabric of choice, not because it was particularly soft, it wasn't, but because it could trap warm air close to the skin and maintain a stubborn fidelity to body heat. And so, dressing was a cold weather weapon. A medieval peasant might start with a linen undertunic. Linen, being slightly gentler on the skin than wool, was close enough to comfort to lull someone into thinking they weren't dressed like a chest of drawers. Over that, wool tunics, dresses, cloaks, and occasionally another person sitting very near completed the ensemble. The more woolen layers you wore, the more you resembled a walking sheep tribute. But insulation wasn't just about fashion, it was also underfoot. What now would be called flooring was, in many cases, just dirt, and medieval dirt was not a tidy sort. To beat the chill and cover evidence of small animal life, families spread straw across the floor, a technique that combined warmth, absorbency, and the lingering aroma of farmyard chic. This straw, sometimes called rushes, acted as a kind of primitive carpet, not particularly plush, but definitely practical, and, if replaced every few weeks, could make a room smell almost like herbal hay rather than freelance goat. Wealthier households might layer sweet-smelling herbs into the rush mix, lavender, mint, even chamomile, although peasants usually had to settle for the aromatic notes of dryish weeds nearby. As night fell, and the hearth did its best impression of a sleepy dragon, the family gathered closer. Medieval hearths weren't wildly efficient, but an open flame, even a small one, was the crown jewel of warmth. Embers were treasured. Coals were nursed like infants, banked beneath ashes overnight to keep the fire smouldering till morning. A child might be dispatched at dawn to prod the hearth like a medieval espresso machine and rekindle the blaze before the frost turned their toes into brittle pretzels. Beds were shared not just for familial closeness, but also thermodynamic strategy. The human body, after all, is a 98.6-degree furnace powered by porridge and planning. Families, sometimes including guests, pets, or the occasional wandering relative, piled into beds with little concern for personal space, but great concern for body heat, If you awoke in the middle of the night with an elbow in your ear and a goat lying at your feet, you were simply experiencing the warm embrace of medieval bedtime community. Blankets, of course, were also woolen, a sentence that doubles as a description of everything in a peasant's life. The beds themselves were often little more than wooden frames filled with mattress stuff, straw again, feathers if you were lucky, and sometimes rags of unknown origins sewn into a large sleepable sack. Lumpy, grateful, and not too damp. That was the dream. For ventilation, windows were occasionally covered with oiled parchment or with a bit of linen dipped in beeswax. Glass was rare until well into the late medieval period, and even then, window glass was more of a frosted suggestion of transparency, not the panoramic views we enjoy today. But let's be honest, the medieval view was probably just more cold people trying to warm up. There was, however, a certain poetry to the glow of firelight on wattle and daub walls, the gentle rustle of straw underfoot, and the way breath turned visible before the heat stirred. Cold, yes, but a kind of close, companionable cold. The kind that makes warmth feel like a reward well earned, not just a thermostat flick away. And so, as the wind whistled down the chimney and the coals pulsed like little rubies in the embered, the family did what they did best. They leaned in, huddled closer, and fell asleep beneath a patchwork of wool and shared history. Now, let us tiptoe onward into the world of medieval beds themselves, where dreams unfolded between straw, feathers, and centuries-old creaks. Now, let's dim the torches and for a moment drift into the medieval evening, that hushed lull between chores and sleep, when the hearth is still stoked with one last brave log, and the smell of smoke mixes with boiled turnips and ambition. It's here, in this dimming hour, that we find the family bedchamber, grandly named, though rarely grand. In most humble households across 13th century Europe, the name bedchamber referred to wherever the bed happened to fit, and bed was often a collaborative arrangement of hay, wool-stuffed sacks, and perhaps most importantly, strong family bonds forged under cold roofs and thicker blankets. You see, central heating hadn't been invented yet, and wouldn't be for several exciting centuries. Radiators were still a glimmer in the eye of the Industrial Revolution. Instead, warmth came piecemeal, from fireplaces, from bodies, and from what you hoped was a cleanish sheep's worth of wool. Now, if you've ever tried wrapping yourself in a wet wool sweater in mid-January, don't. You may be wondering how wool ever saved anyone. But medieval wool production was a true art, and properly prepared wool was both insulating and breathable. Plus, it had a rather charming habit of smelling just slightly like the great outdoors, or at least like the livestock it came from. Blankets in poorer homes were more ambitious in concept than in execution. Rough woven wool blankets would often be stitched together with bits of linen or whatever vaguely cloth-like substance could be begged, borrowed, or skillfully ignored that it came from a sack of onions. But they did the trick. Once you'd layered on 3 blankets and snuggled under with 4 siblings and an alarming number of cats, you were ready for any frost the winter might throw at you. And let's not forget straw. Straw was a medieval multi-tool. It was bedding. It was insulation. It was something to cover the cold floor with, something to pack against walls, and, depending on the day, breakfast for your goat. A pile of straw beneath your wool was an effective way to lift yourself from the frigid draftiness of a cracked stone floor. It was softish, dryish, and replaced often, hopefully. But warmth was communal. Households huddled together at night, and not just people, dogs, chickens, Occasionally, depending on how many times it had been forgiven, the family pig. Contrary to our modern notions of personal space or a room of one's own, medieval nighttime was crowded. Children nestled between parents, cousins tucked in like unexpected foot warmers. Grandmother claimed the spot nearest the fire, and, curiously, the most silence. Firelight itself was not to be trusted entirely. By the fire, warmth radiated onto ruddy cheeks and calloused hands. But as you backed away just a few paces, the night crept back in. Embers were banked carefully to keep glowing overnight. A poorly tended hearth could mean waking up to both cold toes and local legend about how your cousin burnt down half the village. Again, those with means had stone fireplaces with elaborate hoods, often carved with family crests or stern-looking lions. But in cottages and crofts, the hearth was humble. Smoke crept out through a hole in the roof. Or, on particularly disagreeable evenings, it didn't, and you coughed yourself to sleep with a face full of fragrant soot. And then there was the warming pan, for the rare lucky few. This marvelous invention, a shallow metal vessel filled with coals and slid between bedsheets, offered a brief moment of luxury before promptly setting the bed on fire if not used correctly. It's been suggested that medieval attempts at innovation came with exciting insurance premiums payable in goats. Despite inconveniences, like, say, freezing, medieval folks had a particular way of coping. It's called not minding very much. Most grew up in the cold, slept in the cold, and rose with the cold. As long as fingers moved and noses thawed by mid-morning, the system was considered effective-ish. And so they huddled, warm in their shared body heat, cocooned in hand-patched blankets, lulled by the soft crackle of logs and the eternal question, just how much straw makes a bed, and at what point does it simply become a haystack? Sleep didn't arrive neatly, but drifted in as naturally as the hearth smoke curling toward the rafters. No one counted sheep. That would be selfish. The sheep were saving lives, one cozy night at a time. Now, what happened when families had visitors, and absolutely nowhere to put them except next to old Uncle Edric, who snored like a blacksmith in a thunderstorm? That's a tale still warming by the fire. As winter's breath swept across the damp fields of medieval Europe, curling frost around branches that dared reach skyward, families packed themselves indoors like layered pastries. The homes of the medieval poor were not entirely draft-proof, more wind-acquainted, if we're being polite, but clever they were nonetheless in their humble pursuit of warmth. And right there, in the dingy heart of a timber and daub cottage, the real MVP of the season unfurled proudly: straw. Oh yes, good listener, not gold nor fur, but straw, the uncelebrated hero of haylofts and donkey dinners. Whenever a family needed to keep warm, straw arrived not just as bedding, but as insulation, flooring, and, if need be, additional stuffing in a child's tunic. You had a draft from the ill-fitting door, stuff a handful of straw in the gap, coal floor stones, toss down some straw and call it a medieval rug. It crackled a bit underfoot and occasionally invited a mouse or five, but it was certainly warmer than nothing and smelled faintly of pastures, which could be rather pleasant unless one had an aversion to livestock ambience. Above ground level, the thatched roof, also made of straw, was where warmth might attempt escape, but was met with other clever tactics. Extra wool mats were sometimes hung on ceilings inside the house for added insulation, giving homes the approximate ambience of a particularly determined yurt. And in wealthier peasant homes, yes, that contradiction existed, Wooden shutters or old bits of cloth would be nailed up over windows to stop the breeze from dancing waltzes around the kitchen table. Now, let's speak of the wool. Wool was everywhere, in their cloaks, in their bedding, in the occasional unfortunate soup, should a scarf get too cozy with the cauldron. Sheep, without realizing they were fashion moguls, gifted humanity with a textile lifeline. The secret wasn't merely wearing wool, but wearing layers of wool. A tunic over a chemise over another tunic, belted in the middle to trap heat and give you the faint profile of a boiled dumpling. Children were bundled up like medieval nesting dolls, sometimes wearing the cast-offs from grown-ups, sleeves dragging, tunics muddled, and often indistinguishable from the laundry line. Bedtime was a whole performance. Families would sleep together under shared bedding, many under a single enormous woolen blanket that had the warmth of a sheep and the weight of a small ox. If you were a respected elder or simply the one who remembered to grab the biggest bedsock first, you might get the warm corner by the wall. Those nearer the edge braved the nightly chill, and the occasional stealthy foot of a sibling searching for warmth like a textile-seeking missile. Into this cozy chaos stepped the fireplace, or rather, in poorer homes, the hearth. Just an open fire in the center of the room, belching warmth and smoke in equal measure. The fire was never allowed to die. At night, it would be banked, covered with ashes to smother the flames but keep the embers alive until morning. A practical habit and a surprisingly poetic one, as glimmers of heat lived quietly beneath their snowy ash blankets, waiting for dawn like sleepy dragons. There was no central heating, of course, but there was central sleeping. Beds were rare commodities, and many simply slept on piles of straw with perhaps a warm blanket or a tattered sheepskin. The idea was not necessarily to get warm alone, but to get warm together. Body heat was medieval magic, and families leaned into it, literally. If you could nap in an unintended pile of cousins, foot warmers, and a dog or two, you had found medieval hygge. Dogs truly were prized for more than barking and chasing rats. They were unofficial heating systems. A dog nestled against your side could provide more radiant warmth than a week-old cabbage stew, and was less likely to talk back. It wasn't glamorous. It was smoky, crowded, and occasionally itchy. But those long winter nights offered more than just warmth. These were moments of quiet storytelling by firelight, of whispered prayers woven alongside the crackle of logs, of comfort found not in polished stone or silken sheets, but in closeness, in wool-bound limbs and straw-stuffed dreams. By the time embers glowed low and breath fogged in still rooms, the medieval family, tucked just barely into warmth, drifted softly into sleep. Outside, the wind pulled at shutters and found no welcome. Tomorrow, the fire would be stoked again, as would the internal debates about whether Cousin Henry snored louder than the goat. But that's a story for another hearth fire. Let's wander next to where warmth came not from the home, but from the kitchen, and a bubbling cauldron that handed out heat as generously as it did lentils. By the time winter had wrapped its long, icy fingers around the village, every medieval home had transformed into a woolen cocoon of ingenuity and mild discomfort. Heating a house in the 1300s wasn't so much about bringing warmth in, as it was about keeping the terrible cold slightly less enthusiastic about staying. And the battleground where this quiet war was waged? The medieval family bed. Now let's not mistake medieval bedrooms for private sanctuaries of peace and solitude. There were no scented candles, no adjustable memory foam mattresses, and certainly no solo sleeping arrangements for anyone except aristocrats who could afford an entire castle wing, plus 3 serfs just to warm the pillows. For the peasant family in their timber-framed cottage, the bed was less of a luxury and more of a team sport. Typically, the entire family, and often a few guests, younger siblings, or an odd travelling tinker, piled into one bed, or onto a shared platform of straw-stuffed sacks. Picture a human lasagna, layered snugly in a well-seasoned soup of wool, body heat, and the gentle scent of sheep's lanolin still clinging to the homespun blankets. The goal was simple. Crowd together, conserve warmth, and try not to poke anyone with your pointy elbows. Wool, ever the medieval MVP, served as both blanket and sometimes garment. For good measure, people often slept in their clothes, yes, even their day clothes. Because why would you change into night clothes if your night clothes were just a slightly less itchy version of what you already had on? The medieval wardrobe was less outfits for every occasion and more pick a tunic, any tunic. Flannel pajamas did not yet roam the earth. Over that compressed mass of human heat was often placed a coverlet. Thick, felted wool if you were lucky, or stitched together scraps from old rugs if you weren't. These blankets were surprisingly heavy, possibly explaining the medieval tendency to stay in bed long after the rooster began his unrelenting pre-dawn monologue. Interestingly, different social classes approach sleeping with varying degrees of opulence, or rather, varying degrees of sheep. A wealthier household might enjoy feather mattresses, stuffed so full that one might sleep an inch above their spouse, as if floating on a particularly dense cloud of poultry. They would have canopies over the bed, partly for privacy, partly to keep the warmth in, and definitely, let's be honest here, to stop spiders from staging acrobatic descents directly onto your face. Modern problems may require modern solutions, but medieval ones often involved hanging a large rectangle of cloth over your head and hoping for the best. Now, no conversation about medieval warmth is complete without a nod to bed warmers, brass pans with lids filled with hot coals and slipped under the covers just before bedtime. A bit like cuddling with a portable stove, but one that could easily burn your sheets if left in the wrong spot. Medieval sleeping came with risks. Everything came with risks, honestly. Even too much hot porridge might lead to betrayal, or at least a visit to the latrine in the freezing dark. But before you clutch your central heating unit like the miracle it is, there's an unexpected charm to all of this. The nightly ritual of layering oneself in wool and snuggling 5 deep into a bed the size of a modern-day love seat created a sense of closeness that even candlelight couldn't rival. Families told stories, whispered prayers, and sometimes just listened to the wind wear itself out against the thatched roof. It was huddled comfort in a world that demanded resilience and a touch of comedy. What's more, the bed itself wasn't just for sleeping. Oh no. On cold mornings, it doubled as a breakfast nook, a meeting room, and, if you were lucky, a fort to hide from chores. Children might sit in bed and pluck lice from each other's hair, a pastime that, while not exactly glamorous, was at least warm. Husbands and wives argued under those same blankets, made up under them too, and generally carried on the full spectrum of medieval domestic life without so much as putting a stockinged foot on the freezing floor. And still, somehow, people survived. Not only that, they thrived in their woolly nests, found romance beneath the weight of 6 quilts, and managed to raise entire families without single-use hand warmers or flannel-lined duvets. It's humbling, and very, very itchy. Soon, we'll leave the bed and step into the firelit corners of the cottage, the humble hearth where warmth began, and surprisingly, where most of the household business happened. But that tale, like the embers at dusk, is best approached slowly. Meanwhile, above the snug crannies of the hearthside and beyond the gentle crackling of firewood, medieval dwellings harbored another vital piece of the household heat puzzle. Layering, and lots of it. Lovely, lumpy, woolly layering. Yes, before goose-down duvets stole the spotlight, and central heating made us all a little too comfortable. Warmth relied largely on the fine art of stacking things. Blankets, tunics, feather, mattresses, relatives, in creative and questionably breathable combinations. Wool, that old faithful friend, was the star of the show. And if you're picturing something soft and cashmere-like, I'm afraid I must gently adjust your dreams. Medieval wool garments were, let's say, character building. Coarse, itchy, and sometimes dyed with offerings from unsuspecting beetles, they weren't so much comfortable as determined. Wearing 2 or 3 layers of wool wasn't unusual. It was encouraged, not because it felt pleasant, but because it stopped your toes from turning interesting colours. You might put on a linen shirt, clean if you were lucky or wealthy, and over that, a kirtle or tunic, then perhaps another tunic, and then a hooded cloak, often with sleeves wide enough to smuggle a modest turkey. Every layer added not only warmth, but status, structure, and the casual suggestion that you might be swallowed up by your own clothing if offered a strong wind. For those who slept on less than toasty manor floors or tucked themselves beneath thatched roofing without the luxury of a roaring fire, nighttime rituals were a bit of a production. First came the bedding, maybe some straw thoughtfully laid on a wood frame. Straw wasn't just a wonderful mulch. It was the medieval equivalent of memory foam. Sort of. If your memory included scratchiness and occasional rodents. On top of this rustic mattress, households arranged a concoction of textiles and furs. Spare cloaks, old tunics, woolen blankets. Really, anything vaguely warm and not currently inhabited by someone else. Some families even shared beds, not because they enjoyed nightly elbow duels, but because 5 people under one blanket was preferable to 5 icicles with good separation. In colder months, woolen socks and nightcaps were essential accessories. Woolen socks were, of course, hand-knit or homespun, and nightcaps looked charmingly like someone had upturned a funnel on one's head. Worn primarily by men in illustrations, these caps didn't just make peasants look fashionably sleepy. They kept in an astonishing amount of heat, especially since most homes did little to stop wind from meandering through the gaps in the walls like a bored ghost. Now, here's where it gets charming. If you happen to be a family of means, you might own a bed warmer, a lovely brass pan, usually on a long handle, filled with hot coals and gently swirled around between your sheets. It was a medieval preheat cycle, minus the beep and with a dash of danger. If the pan was left too long or knocked over in excitement, you might find yourself not merely warm, but alarmingly so. Many a hay-filled mattress met a smoky end this way, and a family bedtime could quickly turn into a team firefighting drill. For the rest of the population, the majority really, any form of warmth beyond wool and bodily proximity was wishful thinking. Some villagers brought their livestock indoors at night, not just out of kindness, but because a cow snoot is warmer than an open window in January. Chickens might roost in the rafters, sheep huddled by the barn walls, pigs nestled beside children with an enthusiasm that was mutual but pungent. The trick was not just layering yourself in insulation, but building a nest of warmth. Walls of hay bales, shared blankets, even clay bed warmers, baked during the day and wrapped in cloth for a few hours of comforting heat before they went solid and cold like a forgotten potato. Still, despite all this cleverness, winter nights could be long and bitter. And so families talked, prayed, told stories, slow tales filled with saints, dragons, and clever foxes, because the mind too could be warmed by comfort. And it was always better to think of something bright when the world outside your door was white and wind-written. So, with cloaks hung by the door and smoke curling like dreams across the rafters, they nestled down, and if you listen closely, beyond the fire's sigh, past the coo of sleeping chickens, you might just hear the whisper of another forgotten warm-keeping secret. Waiting in the corner shadows of domestic medieval life, it is a curious thing indeed that in the dead of winter, when breath turns to fog and toes become philosophical about what it means to truly exist, a medieval family's best hope for warmth sat not in some grand invention, but in an odd assembly of wool, livestock proximity, and deeply suspicious bedding arrangements. Let us then tread quietly into a small timber-framed cottage somewhere in 14th century England, where the wooden walls do little more than politely observe the wind slipping through their gaps. Now, contrary to popular imagination, people did not simply freeze to death each January with a sigh and a shrug. They employed a rather theatrical array of techniques to keep warm, starting with their clothes, which they wore in layers that could shame an onion. Wool, that glorious fluffy miracle of the sheep kingdom, was the fabric of life. Not the scratchy, enthusiastic wool of holiday sweaters, no. Medieval wool, after much combing, carding, and whispering, became remarkably soft and warm. Men, women, and children wore multiple tunics or kirtles layered atop one another like a well-organized clothing lasagna. Undergarments of linen kept the harshness of wool at bay, though warmth often triumphed over elegance. Socks were a luxury, so old ones were mended until they became more darning than sock. At night, they did what all good mammals do: they snuggled. The family bed was often a communal experience, a tangled nest of humanity, straw mattresses, and the occasional cat who had declared itself nobility and therefore exempt from the cold. The straw mattress, or palliasse, was not your modern orthopedic number, but rather a sack filled with straw or reeds, occasionally arranged by someone sober. Over this lay sheets and blankets, again most often of tightly woven wool. A particularly enterprising household might tuck warmed stones or bricks, heated in the embers of the hearth, between the sheets as medieval bed warmers. They were affectionately called hot stones, and less affectionately called ow, 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 if you rolled onto one unexpectedly. You may ask, but where did they find the heat in the first place? Ah, enter fire, the third member of this wool-straw firelight trinity. The hearth was the beating heart of the home, located centrally and smoking honourably out of an opening in the roof, or later, through a rudimentary chimney. Medieval fireplaces weren't the cosy, flickering dens of today, mind you. They were more like enthusiastic smoke machines with a side hobby of cooking turnips. But their heat, when coaxed and hoarded, provided the warmth desperately needed. Ashes from the fire were not simply discarded. They were banked, carefully piled to preserve embers beneath, so that a fire could be rekindled each morning without fresh flint work. While the fire warmed the main hall, the upper chambers and adjoining rooms grew jealous and frigid. So came the habit of settling in after dusk, meaning people stayed in one spot, ideally close to the fireplace, bundled in cloaks, shawls, and the company of those whose bodily warmth compensated for their imperfect conversation skills. Even the architecture leaned into this struggle. Beds came with wooden canopies and heavy curtains, not for privacy as much as for holding heat hostage. These enclosed sleeping spaces, called box beds or alcove beds, functioned much like a low-tech thermos. Once you and your siblings, and possibly 3 fleas, were inside, it became a manageable microclimate. Still, perhaps the most poetic of warmth-saving strategies came not from beds or fires, but from cows. Yes, it was not uncommon in Northern Europe for the animals to live under the same roof as their human overlords, a situation which the cows bore with dignified resignation. In many longhouses and crofters' cottages, the animals would sleep in a lower section of the structure, while the family bedded down on a raised platform nearby. And what do cows do besides moo and chew cud? They emit heat brilliantly, consistently, bovinely. It was passive heating by passive livestock. The only cost was occasional night mooing and the vague, lingering scent of warm hay and hooves. So, there in the glow of burning logs and snoring uncles, nestled like frost-defying burritos under layers of wool and sibling elbows, our medieval families endured winter with stoic flair and a few smiling sheep in earshot. But what about the morning after, when the fire's embers are faint and frost carves paisley patterns on the inside of your window pane? That, dear listener, is a tale for another breath of candlelight. As the first lazy snowflakes made their silent descent onto the thatched rooftops, medieval households entered what was politely referred to as wet wool season, and less politely referred to as why does everything smell vaguely of sheep and despair season. Yet even as winter tightened its chill grip on the English countryside, the daily rituals of keeping warm carried on with the persuasive determination of a sleepy cat claiming a lap by the fire. By now, the fire in the central hearth had been coaxed into a smouldering glow, cradle of coals protected beneath layers of ash, still warm enough to toast one's fingertips, or a wedge of heavy rye bread, depending on priority. Families developed an entire choreography to keep warm, using nothing more advanced than fire, wool, body heat, and liberal applications of hoping for the best. Since we've already discussed the fire, as good a character in medieval family life as Uncle Osric, who snored like a blessed forge bellows, let's now tiptoe into the world of wool, the insulation that bleated. Wool, you see, was less a material and more a lifestyle. It dressed your shins, padded your cap, lined your bed, and in particularly grim months, occupied your dreams in the form of judgmental sheep who questioned your layering strategies. Most medieval families owned at least one woolen blanket per bed, woven thickly and seasoned by the years with the scent of hearth smoke and the occasional unforgettable mutton stew incident. These blankets weren't soft in the modern sense, but they were loyal. They clung to your limbs like a cold toddler at a crowded feast, and if you were lucky, they only let in the wind when you moved. Particularly clever souls discovered that layering 2 woolen blankets with straw in between was as close as one could get to medieval insulation technology, unless you had an actual thatch roof and didn't mind plucking a few ceiling bits at bedtime. Speaking of straw, it wasn't just for beds and suspicious pies. Dense mats of straw were scattered across the floor of the hall, not simply to catch drips of stew or the frequent drop of roasted turnip, but to trap warmth. Straw was the medieval floor rug, scratchy, temporary, often edible by accident, and very effective when changed at regular intervals shorter than one might hope. Scatter fresh straw in your family's gathering corner. in front of the hearth, opposite the hound's resoundingly claimed patch, and you've got yourself a nice thermal barrier between your slippers, if you had any, and the unkind stone beneath. Now, where straw and wool joined their humble efforts, firelight played its third and most poetic role. Unlike modern lighting, firelight didn't flood the room. It held quiet counsel in the center, providing both warmth and shadow in a rustic chiaroscuro. And where it danced its golden fingers across the walls and faces, it told stories far older than parchment. Stories whispered across generations when the wind howled and the shutters trembled like nervous soldiers at a bow drill demonstration. So when night fell early, as it was stubbornly prone to do in December, a family tucked themselves in by the hearth with all available dogs, children, and second cousins, settled like sediment in a tepid soup. The adults knitted or carved, the children bickered softly before dozing, and the fire did its best impression of a sleeping dragon, exhaling slow breaths down to glowing embers. Some households had what was known as a bedfellow. That is, someone whose job was not only to warm the end of the bed, but also to ensure no one succumbed to the cold or accidentally set their foot wrappings on fire. A noble calling, slightly awkward in execution. And lest we forget, there were the more eccentric warming methods. Heated stones wrapped in cloth, placed cunningly underfoot or in bed before sleep. Bottles filled with warm liquid, usually not wine, to the disappointment of many, serving as what one might generously call proto-hot water bottles, and even onion poultices, though these were more for medicinal warmth than recreational cozying. A quiet warning: onion foot poultices may warm you, but they also guarantee your dreams smell like stewed regret. Yet, even with all these efforts, the medieval family was no stranger to winter's cold bite. But instead of fighting it with constant war, they learned to live with it, layering clothing, huddling together, and telling increasingly tall tales as an informal method of distraction from the fact that no one had felt their toes since Michaelmas. Still, they slumbered. Wool-wrapped, straw-padded, firelit and gently snoring, they folded into winter like parchment into a scroll, riding out the frost storm with a patience carved from necessity and tradition. And as the wind picks up outside the shuttered windows, let's follow them into the quiet hush of night, where warmth waits. Not in the hearth, but in the hush of bedtime breath and the trusting weight of wool. Next, we peer into the garments themselves, and how dressing like a layered onion was the only true defense against a medieval January. It's often said that true luxury is simplicity done well, and nowhere is this more clear than in the humble warmth rituals of medieval nighttime. With no central heating, no heated blankets, and no conveniently overpriced artisanal socks, medieval families mastered the art of staying cozy with very little, except perhaps an unshakable tolerance for the smell of damp wool. As twilight faded into ink-stained darkness and a feathery frost crept across the thatch and timbers, the family hearth transformed from a workstation into a sacred shrine of heat. The fire remained the prized treasure, a frail but loyal flame tucked inside a stone or earthen hearth, guarded like a monarch upon their throne of embers. Every member of the household had a duty to ensure it didn't die out overnight, especially in winter, unless of course you fancied a pilgrimage through the snow in your socks to borrow fire from the neighbor, a practice known, beautifully, as fire fetching, and socially equivalent to turning up at someone's door at 2 a.m, asking for a phone charger and a 3-course meal. But surviving the chill wasn't just a matter of fire. No Fire was merely the lead actor in a carefully orchestrated ensemble performance involving wool, straw, and the remarkable willingness of the human body to adapt to discomfort if it means not freezing solid. Straw, for instance. Poor man's insulation. Humble, crunchy, and ever so slightly pokey, straw was used in layers beneath sleeping pallets, stuffed into mattresses, or even plastered into walls for a bit of primitive soundproofing and draft busting. With enough straw, even the most miserably cold cottage could feel like a gently toasted barn. Emphasis on barn. The scent might be described as earthy by poets and hay fever hell by the rest of us. On top of the straw came wool, glorious, scratchy, never quite dry wool. Wool cloaks, wool hose, wool caps, and for the most fortunate, patchy woolen blankets that may have once been tunics in a previous life. Wool was the fabric of the working night shift, capable of holding in warmth, repelling damp, and with a sufficiently heroic imagination, doubling as evening wear. Layering was an art. Children snuggled together in twos or threes, often using larger family members as living hot water bottles. It was not uncommon for the smallest child to be buried so deep beneath family arms, legs, and surplus tunics that they'd go missing until morning. Some households even slept in a shared bed, lined up like logs, which explains why bedtime disputes had high diplomatic stakes. After all, if Cousin Edric kicked you in the shin at midnight, you had limited retaliatory options when buried firmly under 2 goatskins and your aunt's knees. Of course, open flames and flammable textiles made medieval bedtime something of an adventure. You wanted to be warm, certainly, but not so warm you burst into flames. Fire safety, as we know it, hadn't quite gotten its footing. The glow of the hearth was romantic like a flickering candle, and just as capable of setting your leggings ablaze if you got clingy. Still, folks got creative. It was common to preheat a bed using a warmed stone or brick wrapped in cloth, an early, surprisingly effective ancestor to the modern hot water bottle, and without the risk of springing a leak into your scented mattress. Other households used iron warming pans filled with hot coals to prepare the sheets, which feels wonderfully decadent until you remember that hot coals and linen are not the world's safest drink and chaser. Then there were bed curtains. Yes, even the peasants aspired to them. These heavy, often woolen hangings served not to impress, but to trap body heat and keep out bothersome drafts. A 4-poster bed wasn't a design choice. It was thermal engineering. In family homes without such luxuries, people stuffed rags or dried moss into the cracks in the walls and doors. Some even hung animal skins along the inside walls, which added warmth and the faint, comforting aroma of disgruntled goat. For those with a bit of coin, foot wrapping became a minor sport. Cloth wrappings, socks spun from scratchy threads, and even bespoke foot bags were sewn to keep toes from turning into medieval ice pops. The finest layering combos were likely guarded like trade secrets, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter in grudging whispers like 2 wool, 1 felt, and a borrowed sock from Edmund for luck. As the fire dimmed to its last glowing sigh, and the night grew domed with cold, medieval families drifted into slumber beneath their wool, upon their straw, surrounded by snoring kin and creaking beams. The warmth was earned, cobbled together with care and cleverness, and in the quiet flicker of that shared stillness, we find our next comfort. How morning meals played their own part in warming cold hands, especially when they involved wooden spoons, a bubbling pot, and something suspiciously called pottage. As the chill of twilight tapered into true night, far beyond the drafty reach of the castle halls and beneath that inimitable scent of sheep's wool and old smoke. The humble fireplace took centre stage. Not just a place for stew pots and drying socks, it was, quite frankly, the medieval version of central heating, Netflix, and the security alarm system, all in one glowing bundle of embers. Now picture this: a modest peasant home, made from timber frames and wattle and daub walls that creaked just slightly when the frost tugged at the corners. In the centre, a stone hearth, crackling cheerfully, or occasionally spitting in protest, surrounded by a heap of family and the better-behaved livestock. A chicken might be eyeing your bowl of pottage with designs, but for now, she's content to soak in the warmth. The cat, ancient and inscrutable, is asleep, or perhaps deep in political thought, nearest the fire, as all power brokers were. To keep the house warm, the medieval family deployed an array of creative tactics that balanced necessity with a hearty dollop of superstition and folklore. Straw, for instance, wasn't just for haystacks and the occasional biblical nativity reenactment. It was stuffed between floorboards, piled into mattresses, and sometimes simply strewn across the stone floor to insulate against the creeping cold. This did, of course, invite the occasional uninvited guest, fleas, lice, and their extended family. But that was another kind of warmth, one might argue. It all depended on your attitude. Wool was the undisputed monarch of medieval textiles. It clothed bodies, blanketed beds, and hung thickly over windows and doors like quiet guardians against winter winds. And don't imagine delicate, whispery cashmere. No, this was wool with opinions. Scratchy, fierce, and soaked with the kind of lanolin handshake that told you it had definitely met the sheep recently. Cloaks were common, even indoors. Children toddled around swaddled in layers until they resembled shuffling turnips. And at night, entire families burrowed under heavy woolen bedspreads, often putting heated stones or warm bricks, retrieved obediently from the hearth, into the bedding to chase out the chill first. Where medieval heating lacked in technology, it more than made up for in communal strategy. You didn't stay warm by isolating yourself. That would be both foolish and deeply cold. Instead, people shared beds, regardless of sibling rivalry or who may have eaten the last goosefoot. Bed sharing wasn't just for families. Visitors, apprentices, even strangers, given some amount of trust and a background check involving little more than he didn't steal the pie, might share the feathery crowd. Human body heat, after all, was a renewable resource. Of course, one could always rely on sheer movement to generate warmth. Daily chores, like chopping wood, tending fire, hauling water, wrestling with the philosophical implications of dairy, kept the body busy enough to stay toasty. Woolen hats were worn to bed, not because anyone fancied cosplay with a turnip merchant, but because heat escapes quite dramatically through one's head, and even medieval folks knew how to defend a noggin. Lighting, while not strictly a heat source, played its own subtle part in the illusion of warmth. Firelight flickered soft gold over whitewashed walls, its shimmer making everything feel just a little bit closer, a little more animated. Shadows danced, sometimes uncannily like Aunt Maud's elbow, but more often like silent puppet plays of the day's forgotten toils. Candles, though expensive, joined in when needed. Rushlights, the economy version, think of them as budget-friendly, vaguely smoky wax decor, provided thinner glows, but still enough to keep the dark from pressing in. And here's a curious trick. Many homes were built with low ceilings, not just an architectural quirk, but a heat-saving measure. Warm air rises, of course, so keeping that warm air within shouting distance meant you could curl up on the floor near the hearth and feel an almost luxurious kind of warmth, by medieval standards anyway. Add a snoring hound, a nap-ready baby goat, and a wool-clad granny murmuring about St. Cuthbert's restorative soup, and suddenly, winter didn't seem so grim. Even the fire itself was carefully husbanded. Banked beneath ashes overnight to preserve hot coals, it was coaxed back to life each morning with care and the urgency of someone who's just stepped barefoot onto an icy flagstone. Matches were not a thing. Fire was precious, and nowhere more so than in hearth and home. And so, bundled in memory and scratchy wool, lit by flickering fire and the occasional poetic flatulence of the family dog, our medieval friends settled into the nighttime chill, which leads us, gently, to the curious rituals of bedtime itself. In the quiet hush of a medieval winter evening, the hearth wasn't just the heart of the home. It was the furnace's manager, the security guard, and the family therapist all in one. As the flames danced in their stony stage, crackling like nature's applause, families gathered in close, not just for warmth, but for mild survival. The fire needed constant tending, of course. While we now enjoy thermostats that respond politely to thumb taps, your average 14th century household relied on someone, usually the youngest with the nimblest knees, to poke the embers, feed the fuel, and swat away sparks with a stick long enough to be both helpful and ominous. But logs weren't endlessly abundant, and when they were usually wet. What you really wanted was dry oak or beech, split well before the snows came, and stored under something better than near a wall and under a hope. Firewood wasn't just a means to stay warm, it was practically currency. A neatly stacked pile might as well have been a fortress of gold. It wasn't uncommon to chain up wood under lock and keystone key, calmly warding off both fire thieves and nosy neighbours who claimed they were just borrowing. Now, for those slightly better off or wildly lucky, there were braziers, metal bowls on legs filled with glowing coals that you'd move from room to room like a glowering, moody pet. They hissed at your touch, made the air feel dense and musky, and could heat a person's toes while simultaneously threatening to toast their robes. A delicate balance, medieval heating. And still, for most, if you wanted heat to last through the night, you didn't start with wood. First came straw, not the golden, fanciful kind from storybook illustrations, but the itchy, fibrous reality of harvested wheat stalks. It went everywhere, in shoes, in bedding, in corners. You could almost chart the average family's movements just by following the scratchy trail. A popular technique was filling bed mattresses, or rather sacks masquerading as mattresses, with straw, then layering them with thick blankets, woven from, wool. Gloriously itchy wool. If warmth had a mascot in medieval Europe, it wore sheep on every limb. Everyone trudged through winter swaddled like particularly grumpy onions, layer upon layer of woolen garments, some of which had moth holes charming enough to serve as windows. Wool, you see, had staying power. It trapped body heat like a polite kidnapper and never seemed to mind moisture. Wet wool isn't charming, but it is stubbornly warm, which made it suitable for everything from cloaks to drawers. No one said fashion was a priority. The medieval motto might as well have been, does it cover your behind, and does it itch? Then wear it. There was another technique too. The family huddle. Entire broods, bundled in cloaks and shared blankets, would claim one side of the hearth like a sleepy parliament of humans. Pets joined the pile. Chickens weren't always excluded. It got crowded. Elbows met ribs. But there was warmth, communal and stubborn, like a sleepy protest against frost. And on truly grim nights, when even the blanket pile felt thin and the wind made a hobby of howling, some families would turn to the old trick: heated stones wrapped in cloth, tucked into beds before sleep. These weren't exactly hot water bottles, more like prehistoric radiators, and they worked to a degree, provided you didn't accidentally kick one and startle yourself into next Tuesday. Of course, all of this warmth generation required coordination, planning, and a certain amount of whisper yelling about who left the hearth unattended. But amidst the embers, the creak of wood, and the smell of slightly singed wool, there was a comfort in the ritual. Warmth wasn't just a temperature, it was an effort shared by all, passed down like a recipe too imprecise to write down. And as the fire dimmed into ember glow, and the shadows grew long around the straw-packed floor, the house didn't cheerfully hum with central heating, but it did breathe gently with the warmth of bodies, wool, and age-old wisdom. And so, let us draw the coverlet a bit higher, rest our weary ankles by the brazier's half-hearted heat, and gently wander toward what else medieval folks did just before turning in for a frosty night, sometimes involving prayer, and occasionally something much more sniffly. By now, the medieval home has shown itself to be a patchwork of determined coziness and limited resources, a kind of historical IKEA showroom, albeit with fewer Allen keys and considerably more sheep. But as evening fell and the temperature dipped like a friar's ladle into the cold stew pot, the art of staying warm became less quaint and more essential. Enter the curious character of the medieval bed. Now, let's not mistake this for a bed in the modern sense. No posture-supportive mattress or built-in USB ports here. The medieval bed was a wooden frame, often grand if you were wealthy, or quite literally a pile of straw if you were not. And regardless of your social standing, the warmth of the bed depended mostly on three things: body heat, creativeness, and layers. Lots and lots of layers. Feather beds, for those who had the means, were plump sacks filled with downy feathers, the original weighted blanket, but with a slightly higher chance of attracting unwelcome poultry-related puns. Beneath the feather bed might be a straw mattress stuffed into a coarse linen tick. This was not the sort of straw you'd feed a show pony either. It was scratchy, and yes, occasionally alive with things one does not name right before bedtime. Then there were the bed companions. You see, it wasn't just rare to sleep alone in the Middle Ages. It was often considered wildly impractical. Families piled into beds like kittens in a basket, drawing on the most ancient and reliable heating system humanity has ever known: each other. One chronicled peasant family from Norfolk was said to sleep 6 to a straw mattress. Not because they particularly enjoyed Cousin Walter's nighttime snoring recitals, but because body heat was no joke when the wind howled through the shutters. And don't think the nobility escaped this snuggle economy. While the well-to-do wrapped themselves in what might have looked like a portable tent wobbling with wool and velvet, they too often bundled together, albeit with more fanfare. A lady's boudoir might include fur-lined sheets, but she also had a handmaid or two near at foot, ready to stoke fire or fetch another eiderdown. In some cases, bedchambers included drapes, a small detail to modern eyes, but in the medieval world, bed curtains were not a luxury, they were a necessity. Why? Because they trapped heat like a marshmallow under a teacup. These thick tents of wool or embroidered cloth weren't about modesty, they were insulation. Items like bed stockings and night rails, essentially medieval pajamas, completed the ensemble. Imagine going to bed wearing socks that go up to your thighs and a bonnet that could double as window treatment. Fashionable? Not exactly. Toasty? Absolutely. Speaking of bedtime attire, it must be said that sleeping together, literally under shared blankets, required a certain etiquette. Farting in bed, according to one 14th century monastery's specific rules, could result in disciplinary action. Yet this didn't stop the famed poet Chaucer from alluding to bodily noises with delightfully ambiguous metaphors. Let us merely say, the medieval mind was inventive, and the medieval mattress knew too much. Now, over in draftier homes, where luxuries like four-poster structures remained a speck on a faraway tapestry, parents would sometimes place stones by the fire to warm up, then wrap them in cloth and slip them under the children's blankets, a sort of crude medieval hot water bottle, only rockier. And if you were particularly lucky, or perhaps unlucky, you shared your bed with a dog or even a chicken. Farm animals weren't just warm, they were valuable, and if letting a goose roast its feet near your toes meant fewer frostbitten mornings, then so be it. Somewhere out there is a long-lost ballad about a grateful toe-warming hen. So, the medieval bed was a place of pure functionality, with maybe a whisper of romance on feast nights. It was family, fire-warmed rocks, flea-prickled straw, and whispered prayers clutched beneath quilts stitched from mother's linens and father's patched hose. And if all else failed, if the bed was still too cold, the wind too sharp, and your sibling's elbow permanently lodged beneath your shoulder blade, they could always get up. Yes, that's right. Some would rise before dawn, especially in winter, and simply start the day early by stoking the hearth before the frost soaked in too deep. But that fire, the gentlest hearth glow bouncing off cracked stone walls and sleepy eyelids, it held secrets of its own. For while the bed fought off the cold at night, the hearth is where warmth was born. And that, dear dreamer, takes us from the bedroom to the beating heart of the home, where embers wait to speak. Imagine, for a moment, a woolen sock. Then imagine that sock has ancestors who were armor-bearers in the war against frostbite. That humble item, when multiplied by the dozens and stuffed with, well, other woolen things, becomes a medieval bed. Yes, that's where we're going this evening. Under the covers. Not just any covers, but the luxurious, scratchy, slightly sheep-scented bedding of a 14th century peasant or noble, depending on who had the fluffiest sheep. Now, before you get too cozy, remember, mattresses weren't springy little clouds of convenience. They were fabric sacks, usually linen, sometimes old canvas, that had been gloriously stuffed. With what? Options. And none of them involved memory foam. There was straw, of course. That classic golden staple that creaked like a chorus of awkward mice every time you rolled over. Then came feathers, if you were rolling in coin. Or more precisely, if you weren't rolling in poo. Because goose down was prized, but geese themselves were picky and territorial, and capturing their softness was not without pecking consequences. For the budget sleeper, dried leaves, sedge, and bracken were decent contenders. Aromatic, natural, and thrillingly crunchy. Slumber with a whiff of woodland. Don't mind if I do. But wool played the long game in sleep strategy. Mattress ticking might be layered with wool wadding. Heavier, warmer, not terribly breathable, but infinitely more dignified than sleeping on hay like a festive donkey. Blankets, then, the true champion of bedtime coziness. In a time without central heating, duvets had not yet risen to power. Blankets were legion. heavy, woven, and often made of that good local wool that had been carded, spun, dyed, if you were fancy, and finally fulled until it was thick enough to smother a snowstorm. These were not light throws from your friendly neighborhood home boutique. These were serious textiles, sleeping fortresses. The wealthier you were, the more layers you could afford, and you needed them. Medieval English winters weren't paved with mild inconvenience. They were windswept carols of frozen toes and sleepily muttered oaths. And so, when bedtime came, preparation was a ritual. First, you'd undress, but not fully. Night clothes were inconsistent. I mean in design, not behavior. Most folks slept in their long woolen shifts, their underclothes, or occasionally nothing at all if they were rebels or roasting from too many fire embers. You didn't need fancy pajamas, you needed insulation. A peasant might wear tomorrow's tunic to bed, simply so it would be warm when putting it on the next day. Efficiency, my dear listeners, with a hint of latent body heat. Next came the bed curtains. Oh yes, beds with curtains. Oft dreamt of nowadays, then a necessity. Whether you were in a manor house with carved oak posts or in a modest cottage with a curtain strung from beams, the point was the same. Trap the warmth, expel the drafts, and more importantly, keep nosy animals from nibbling your toes. By the flickering glow of a dying fire, the family bed, sometimes shared among multiple members and possibly a domesticated pig or two, became more than furniture. It was an ecosystem. The father might tell a story, the mother might lull a baby. Older children nestled like inconveniently large ducklings. If you were lucky, the dog would curl at your feet like a furry ember. If you weren't, the fleas would host a reunion gala in your hair. Of course, not everyone shared a bed from necessity. It was warm, yes, but also traditional, for moral, social, and thermal reasons. A traveller might lodge with a stranger and be expected to share a bed, trading tales and warmth like polite human furniture. In castles, even monarchs had companions in their large, cloth of gold festooned beds, not necessarily for mischief, but for companionship. The nights were long, the wind was chatty, and the bed was far too wide not to. The air inside a bed-curtained enclave was distinct, close, rich with rustic smells, and bearing the dreams of cold noses and croft-side fantasies. And should someone snore, they became part of the ambience, like background music in an ancient tavern. And despite all this, the ticking mattresses, the woolly fortresses, and hearths snuffing out into embers, the people slept. Possibly cold, possibly itchy, but asleep nonetheless, because sleep, like soup and singing, finds a way. Next, let's trace our fingers across the soot-darkened hearthstones and see how embers were tucked in like sleeping children, kept alive till dawn, with tricks as old as fire itself. Somewhere between the scent of singed turnips and the distant clatter of a cowbell, a medieval evening softly settled over yet another thatched roof household. The sun had long retired behind the hills, pulling with it what precious little warmth the day had offered. And inside the family gathered for their nightly ritual, not of prayer or poetry, but of the time-honored game called Find the Warm Spot before someone else sits on it. You see, within those timber-framed walls, warmth wasn't merely a matter of physics. Oh no, it was a domestic strategy, a chess match played with cloaks, coals, and a very suspiciously flatulent hound named Godric. Unlike modern homes with their thermostats and throw blankets embroidered with puns, medieval families worked with three staples of comfort: wool, straw, and firelight. Today, we pause and pay homage to the humble fire, not the great roaring inferno of castle halls, but the tiny, smoky hearths at the center of peasant homes. Imagine it, a roughly circular stone pit, perhaps a bit skewed after someone tripped over it late last night, filled with faltering embers, with every soul present huddled around it like moths with a mortgage. Firewood was precious, often more valuable than a neighbor's promise not to borrow your tools and never return them. Gathering wood was not only time-consuming, it was legally complicated. Forests were often claimed by the lord of the manor, which meant sneaking in to fetch a few sticks came with the thrilling risk of fines, beatings, or, for the particularly unlucky, a short stay in the stocks next to Jeff the local drunk, who never once stopped singing. Thus, families got creative. They employed what they called the banked fire method, covering coals with ashes at night so the embers could smolder safely until morning. This allowed them to coax a new flame into life without wasting precious tinder. Children often took on the role of ember custodians, a grand title for the task of poking the ashes at sunrise with a very serious stick. Now, firelight itself wasn't just for warmth. It was the all-purpose illuminator, ambiance provider, and smoke inhalation therapy device. Chimneys were little more than vague suggestions in many homes. Instead, smoke found its own mysterious route upward, often through the thatch, sometimes through one's face. While this gave residents a perennially smoky aroma, perfect for confusing predators or nearby Frenchmen, it also had the unintended benefit of preserving the thatch from mold and pests. Nothing says pest control like a ceiling that periodically bursts into flame. Families arranged their straw bedding strategically, closest to the fire, but not so close as to spontaneously combust, usually. These beds were sacks or piles of straw stuffed into alcoves or lined against the draftiest walls. Covering them were thick woolen blankets, lovingly woven with equal parts function and scratchiness. Wool was the medieval miracle fabric, warm when wet, durable and itchy enough to keep you moving so you didn't freeze. For larger families, sleeping arrangements became an exercise in thermodynamic efficiency. Layering was key. People slept elbow to elbow, sometimes across generations and species. The dog curled at your feet? Not a luxury. It was a heat source. The goat staring at you from the end of the bed. Just visiting, probably. And the baby tucked under grandma's armpit. Toasty and unimpressed by your notions of personal space. Windows, being enthusiastic drafts with a wooden frame, rarely helped matters. They were often just shutters, no glass, and remained firmly closed in winter, unless open to let the smoke escape or to shout at Jeff to please go home this time. To make things more bearable, some folk turned to bed warmers, metal pans filled with embers shoved under the blankets like a cozy rage volcano. Using one carried the dual thrill of warmth and the vague possibility of setting your bedsheets on fire, which added a certain charm to bedtime. And all of this, the cramped space, the smoky air, shared warmth and quiet flicker of firelight, created a very particular kind of evening, equal parts uncomfortable and intimate. It was an embrace of necessity and closeness, the kind of warmth that could not be bought, only shared. Somewhere in that soft, smoky glow, a child blinked sleepily, curled against an older sibling, wrapped in wool, lulled by the hiss of a log settling in the fire. The dog, Godric, snored unevenly beside them, having claimed the warmest spot yet again. And just beyond the door, the frost began to bloom in delicate constellations upon the latch. It is there, on that frost-kissed threshold, that we pause. For when morning comes, it brings more than light. It brings chores, rumbles, and a clever way to use manure. But that, as always, is better left for another night. Envision, if you will, a moonlit medieval hamlet on a crisp January night. The stars twinkle with smug detachment above thatched rooftops, while frost daintily sketches lace patterns on shuttered windows. The chimney smoke coils skyward like sleepy serpents, and inside, under low timber ceilings, the real battle of winter is underway. The noble quest to stay warm without burning down the house. The fire, naturally, is the heart of this operation. A hearth, not merely a place to cook the family's unrecognizably charred pigeon stew, but the medieval version of central heating. Though instead of radiators and smart thermostats, you had embers, shoulder-width stonework, and a constant fear of catching your hem on fire. Cozy. Evening fires had to be tended with the precision of a very underpaid dragon trainer. The goal wasn't a roaring blaze, far too wasteful and downright scandalous. The goal was a controlled, gentle heat that wouldn't guzzle the firewood like Sir Hubert at the tavern's ale festival. To preserve a night's warmth, the last family member to bed would bank the fire, covering the glowing embers with ashes to keep it alive without too much oxygen. This allowed the coals to stealthily simmer through the night, ready for rekindling at dawn. And yes, if you were the one banking the fire every night, you definitely had leverage in household negotiations. No, Margaret, I will not fetch the eggs today. I preserved the fire. I am the hearth guardian. Now, even the most faithful fire can't do it all alone. Enter wool, God's coziest contribution to domestic survival. Medieval folk viewed wool as something between a miracle and a lifestyle. It was used for everything from socks to sleeping gowns, cloaks to covers, and on special occasions, extremely scratchy underpants. Blankets made of thick hand-woven wool weren't soft in the modern sense. They were more, how shall we say, committed. They didn't flutter or drape. They pressed you into bed like a polite, heavy-handed ghost, whispering, "You shall not escape this warmth, nor move your legs much either." But that heaviness created the sort of insulation that mattered on a February night, with only a damp breeze and the odd owl for company. Straw, too, had a starring role. Not the gold-spinning fairy tale kind, but the very practical filler variety. Beds were essentially sacks of straw called ticks, which were, regrettably, not named for the creatures that lived in them, though that would have been brutally honest. These straw mattresses were lumpy, noisy, and slightly crispy, but they created a buffer between sleeper and icy floorboards. Combined with woolen bedding, they formed a passable nest of comfort, provided one didn't mind the occasional crunch under one's shoulder blade. And speaking of floors, if you lived in a humble cottage, that floor was often packed earth, notorious for its artistry in absorbing cold like a thirsty sponge. Families learned to elevate their lives quite literally by sleeping on wooden platforms or raised boards, sometimes shared between many family members, and on occasion, a neighbour named Gervais, who just needed a place to stay the night, and somehow remained all winter. Medieval families slept close not merely for affection, but for survival. Body heat was, they didn't know this term but we do, a renewable energy source. Parents, children, and perhaps a dog or three huddled together in what might generously be described as a snuggle pile, and less generously as an unventilated mound of limbs. The dog predictably always took the warmest spot, usually the middle, often with zero remorse. For those with just a bit more wealth, bed curtains added a final layer of defense against the nightly chill. These heavy fabric panels cocooned the bed, trapping warmth and rather helpfully muffling the enthusiastic snoring of one-eyed Uncle Bastian. The medieval canopy bed wasn't about drama or flair. It was insulation, practical drama, if you will. Still, no matter how many wool layers were worn, no matter how many bodies were crammed beneath a tattered blanket, the key antagonist of the evening remained: the draft. Medieval houses had drafts like modern houses have Wi-Fi. They seeped through every crack, every wattle and daub wall, whistling up calves and ears, and occasionally marital tensions. To outwit the drafts, people stuffed gaps with moss or rags, or hung tapestries. Yes, those slightly unsettling wall hangings that looked like a unicorn commune celebrating tax season. They weren't just decorative, they were insulation avant la lettre. So, on those endless winter nights, with ash-covered coals glowing faintly in the hearth, with children snoring beside chickens roosting in the corner, with mother wrapped in her 14th shawl, and father muttering about how warm it used to be in our 82, the entire household drifted off. Slumber arrived not with silence, but with the sound of straw rustling, fire sighing, and wool cloaking dreams like fog across a moor. And just when the cold seemed to have claimed victory, the rooster began to stir, and soon it was time to see how the morning fire would be reborn. But that, dear listener, is another flicker of history yet to catch flame. Not far from the flickering firelight, under the thatched roof, still whispering with the weight of winter's breath, a medieval family's hearth was a stage not just for cooking, but for an entire ecosystem of sleepy warmth strategies. Tonight, we wander once more into that snug and somewhat smoky little world, where firelight danced half-heartedly on soot-dark walls, and toes were wiggled into conscious thought beneath layers of wool as thick as pie crust. You may recall, in the dim hours before artificial heating and Pinterest-worthy insulation, the most advanced central heating system available was named Sitting Very Close Together. And perhaps nestled around a fire that occasionally smoked more than it heated because chimneys, being the luxurious modern marvels they are, were still something most homes did not fully commit to until well into the later Middle Ages. Instead, the smoke was handy. It preserved meats, cured beams, and prevented pigeons from moving in under the rafters, which, from a rustic perspective, might be called multitasking. Now, in tonight's gentle candle glow of recollection, let us stroll our minds across a curious item in every medieval homestead. Not central heating, alas, but something far more humble and strangely beloved, the bed-warming pan. Ah yes, the bed-warming pan. A wild concoction of medieval optimism and semi-controlled fire hazard. Imagine, if you will, a long-handled shallow pan made of brass or copper, filled with glowing embers from the hearth, deliberately carried into the bedroom like a gentle flaming pie of hope. The pan would then be tucked under the bed covers and moved gently back and forth to chase off the icy grip of stone walls and drafty windows. And chase it away they did, unless, of course, one moved too enthusiastically and singed the linen or started a light mattress blaze. Which happened, often. But think of the courage, preparing to nap atop smouldering tan-coloured hay and then voluntarily shoving a pan of fire beneath your blanket. Medieval people truly valued warmth, or perhaps they simply refused to freeze in silence. Yet not all could afford such daring metal contraptions. For many, the bed warmer was a shared child or two, children being rather toasty when bundled, and mobile enough to be rearranged if someone's feet got cold. This practice, charmingly known as warming the bed with the young, often meant that the youngest child slept in the middle, a cozy honour that did come at the cost of having very little room to turn over, and the regular risk of being sneezed on during the night. Even livestock offered auxiliary heating options. The family pig, for instance, might live nearby or indoors, not out of novelty or affection, but because it radiated a pleasing porcine heat. The warmth worked both ways. The pig appreciated the house, and the family appreciated the pig. It was a time before insulation, but blessedly before HOA restrictions on barnyard cohabitation. But perhaps the most overlooked marvel of medieval heating ingenuity lay in the layers. The Holy Trinity: linen, wool, and more wool. Nighttime clothing wasn't quaint. It was a survival kit sewn from necessity and blear-eyed defiance of the winter wind. People didn't sleep in sleek pajamas. Oh no. They heaved themselves into multiple layers of undertunics, overshifts, woolen caps, and sometimes even cloaks. A family might refer to this as getting ready for bed, but it more closely resembled prepping for a small personal expedition to the Alps, except the Alps were your own bedroom, and nestled between straw-stuffed mattresses, with the dog under the bed and the cat nuzzled, uninvited, between someone's knees, the family would ease themselves towards slumber. The fire would crackle down to whispering embers, the shutters would creak lightly in the wind, and someone, usually a grandfather, would mumble about how this winter's not near as cold as the one back in 72, even if 72 hadn't yet happened. All these little rituals, imperfect as they were, created something oddly effective. Not just heat, but comfort, the kind born of closeness, of layers, of sharing breath and laughter and the occasional bit of snoring. And so, as the warmth finally circled through that humble room, through copper pans, shared quilts, whispering fires, and the goodwill of huddled bodies, you may find that even in a world without thermostats, some nights were perfectly warm. Now pull that blanket up just a tad higher. We've not yet reached the final flickers of flame. There's a bit more to explore just past the hearth. Now, as we drift deeper into the long, flickering twilight of a medieval winter's eve, tucked between hay-stuffed mattresses and scratchy wool nightshirts, we must consider the final frontier of warmth for the slumbering family, the bedtime routine, or, as they might have described it, not freezing to death with style. In the 13th century, there was no such thing as central heating. There was barely central anything. Life was a series of small, regional efforts. And so it was when night fell. The medieval family was left to battle the cold, using only wits, wool, perhaps a hint of garlic for courage, and furniture that creaked with existential dread. They began with layers, not measurements of temperature, but measurements of fabric. Linen underclothes, then wool over that, then more wool, and perhaps a final shawl made from whatever the shepherd's wife had left, after knitting for her 17 children. You did not so much get dressed for bed as construct a human onion, each layer an act of medieval defiance against the biting night air, and also a modesty measure, because remember, bathing was rare and surprise breezes frequent. Next came the bed, such as it was. Contrary to many Hollywood imaginings, the average peasant bed was not a rustic four-poster bathed in candlelight. More likely, it was a wooden frame stuffed with straw, wool scraps, or, if life was particularly generous, dried rushes sprinkled with herbs to mask the scent of all the previous nights you hadn't gotten around to changing it out. The truly cozy families, however, had a technique of cuddling down known as the sleep heap. This was not a formal name, mind you, just what happened when families with limited space and a collective fear of frostbite simply piled into one bed. Parents, children, a grandmother or two, perhaps a cousin visiting from the next hamlet over, all bundled together, creating a biologically efficient formation somewhere between penguin huddle and emergency shelter. For warmth, body heat was the currency. Children were considered excellent heat sources, being both small and durable. More than one medieval parent likely murmured, "Come here, child. It's time to be useful," before tucking them in like a hot water bottle with occasional opinions. If someone had access to wealth or even moderate well-being, a term one medieval scholar might define as owns both a pan and the mule, then they might also own a bed warmer. This was a metal pan with a long handle, filled with embers from the hearth and slid between layers of blankets to preheat the bed. Naturally, careful timing was required, lest preheating turn into pre-burning. Nothing ruins a good night's sleep, like discovering your mattress has developed flames. But the crown jewel of nighttime warmth, the apex of cozy sophistication, was the humble nightcap. Not the drink, the literal woolen cap worn to bed. Why? Because in a home where the roof was made of thatch and the walls were more ambience than insulation, your ears were very much at risk of becoming midnight icicles. A simple knit cap could mean the difference between sweet dreams and waking up convinced you were a monastery gargoyle. Now and then, even the fire would be kept just barely alive overnight, banked low under ash to smoulder like a sleepy dragon. This wasn't just for breakfast convenience, but to maintain a hint, a ghost, of radiant warmth. Alas, chimney science was still in its awkward teenage phase, and smoke often preferred to hang around indoors. It's said that many a medieval child fell asleep to lullabies sung by a coughing grandmother. And then, silence. Hearth gone quiet. Rushlights extinguished. A single candle flickering its last golden breath. The room darkens like a stage after curtain call. Somewhere in the attic beams, mice begin their night shift, and beneath a pile of threadbare wool, warmed by breath, closeness, and hope, a family surrenders to slumber. Morning will come eventually. The fire will need stirring, the rushes sweeping, the chamber pot emptying. Joys for another time. But tonight, the wind howls like a disappointed Latin tutor. And still, the family sleeps on, wrapped in tradition, hay, and hand-me-down wool. And speaking of howling winds, there's something quite curious about window coverings back then. But that, my sleepy listener, belongs to another breath of candlelight. It was a peculiar sort of romance, really. The enduring relationship between medieval humans and wool. Season after season, they returned to one another, like star-crossed lovers bound by practical considerations and the constant threat of frostbite. Wool was everywhere. It was not simply a fabric, it was a full-body lifestyle choice. And in the windswept months of medieval winters, it was also a matter of survival. Let us drift now through the muffled quiet of a village under snow. The smell of wood smoke folding into the air like a thick blanket, mingling with the scent of wet sheep, drying herbs, and someone's attempt at a burnt onion pottage. Out here, warmth wasn't a convenience. It was a fantastically complicated team sport. At the center of it all stood the hearth. Glowing, sooty, temperamental. The fire itself was rarely impressive. More of a glowing suggestion of heat than anything cinematic, but it served its purpose well enough. Firewood was precious after all, and not to be wasted on flamboyant flames when embers did the job with far more economy and very little drama. Everything within the house conspired to trap that heat in, as if the building itself were tucking in for a long nap. Walls, often infilled with a cheerful mix of straw, mud, and whatever else was handy. A medieval flavour of home insulation, known as wattle and daub, tried valiantly to keep out the chill. That is, assuming the gaps weren't letting in gusts strong enough to scatter your chess pieces, which were probably carved from bone or bits of firewood. Straw, humble and scratchy, had its time to shine too. It was strewn generously across the floors, acting as insulation against the cold earth, and occasionally doubled as bedding, sometimes triple duty if you were clever. Dog bed, floor mat, and pillow in a pinch. This straw was shaken out and replaced periodically, which is to say, when someone finally decided the house smelled more like goat than they were comfortable with. Now, turn your gaze to the sleeping arrangements, an exercise in both creativity and survival instinct. Whole families would pile together under layers of rough, spun woolen blankets, often still smelling faintly of sheep and last week's cabbage stew. But warmth was warmth. They slept abreast in shared beds, sometimes 3 or 4 to a straw mattress, with the youngest squashed in the center, like prized apples in a human fruit bowl. Cuddling, in this context, was compulsory, an unpaid nightly obligation of the highest order. Children learned the fine art of blanket thievery early on, a skill often perfected by age 6, and punished only by the communal glare of a coal-footed sibling. Parents, meanwhile, may have exchanged weary looks across the pillow, both assessing whether there was time to rekindle the fire before the toddler began snoring at decibels, usually reserved for bagpipes. External solutions were few but embraced eagerly. People cloaked themselves not only in wool, but also in practicality. There were bedstocks, early bed frames with boxed sides to keep heat trapped around the sleeper, or even bed curtains, woven thick and drawn like theatre drapes around one sleeping space, where the play was titled A Night Without Frostbite. Foot warmers, small boxes filled with coals, were employed during particularly ambitious evenings, though these came with the implicit understanding that one oughtn't fall asleep with burning embers near sensitive toes. And let's not forget bed warmers, handled pans full of hot coals, slid beneath the sheets to toast the bedding before entry. A luxury certainly, and not without the occasional scorched mattress. Even the chamber pot, a comfy evening companion that resided beneath the bed, did its part by sparing you a shivery midnight dash outside. The medieval loo was not kind to those who had to fumble with laces and layers under a star-choked sky. In many homes, animals were invited in, not out of love, but out of thermodynamic necessity. A few chickens underfoot, or a sheep sleeping near the door, could mean the difference between merely cold and genuinely regrettable. The family pig, should you be so fortunate, was often considered quite the luxury heating device, provided you could ignore the sounds of enthusiastic snuffling in the darkness. And so, the night passed, softly, wrapped in the ticklish embrace of wool and the honest creak of wooden beams, each breath a puff in the cold air, each snore a lullaby of simple survival. But as the moon wanes and coals sink low in the hearth, one final ember waits to tell you how the first glimmer of warmth arrived with morning. And so, as the last peat-scented curl of smoke from the hearth drifts lazily through the thatched rafters, we find ourselves nearing the quiet heart of a medieval winter's night. The door has been barred. The fire ebbs gently, casting flickering orange shadows that dance along uneven wattle and daub walls. Outside, the frost thickens on the thatch like an icing fit for a peasant's birthday barley loaf. An imagined luxury, both sweet and wholly unaffordable. By now, The family is nestled together like spoons in a drawer that no longer properly closes. The parents lay closest to the embers, their faces lit just enough to show lines carved deeper with every cold season survived. The youngest child sleeps in the crook of a sibling's arm, while the dog, if they were blessed with such a noble mongrel, curls bovinely at their feet, contributing a loyal warmth that's half love, half livestock. Wool cloaks, slightly damp from yesterday's sleet, dry slowly on the ladder-like frame strung above the fire. A structure that was used both for hot smoked sausages and the drying of the occasional unlucky sock. The air is thick with the mineral musk of scorched wool and the earthy ghost of today's onion porridge. Somewhere from the loose floorboards, a mouse dares to creak, and someone in their sleep swats blankly at the noise, mistaking it for a dream or a disagreeable saint. This is not a world of silence, not really. It is a hum of comfort, born of necessity. The rustle of straw mattresses being shifted as a shoulder seeks a warmer hollow. The shuffle of feet under homemade blankets that weigh as much as a sensible sheep. The low, steady breathing of a household whose warmth relies not just on fire, but on closeness. Because warmth in the medieval home was not an individual affair. No radiators hummed in noble solitude. Heat was a communal exchange, a barter of body temperature, a negotiation of elbows, and the occasional apology for an icy foot against a very surprised shin. Even the family pig, if particularly beloved, might get top bunk privileges during the harshest frosts, a practice that scandalized later historians, but made immeasurable sense to those hoping to both survive the winter and ensure their bacon was well marbled come spring. The woolen garments, laboriously spun and woven, layer the sleepers in a sort of padded understanding with the cold. Undergarments of itchy simplicity nest snugly beneath tunics of thicker weave. A blanket was never just a blanket. It was often the stitched-together story of discarded garments, worn and rewoven until fabric and family were indistinguishable. Above them, the thatched roof crackles softly as ice expands in its waterlogged reeds. The loft, if they had one, might contain a child or two beneath a hay bale and a fur, sleeping beside cured apples tied up in string, and dreaming of warm bread and beeswax candles. The smell of stored herbs seeps down gently into their sleep. Dried thyme and mint, lavender if they were lucky, hoping to both ward off moths and keep the children smelling faintly less like ponds. In the village beyond, the world dozes. The blacksmith's forge is dead cold, the church bell silent, the alehouse door bolted by elderly hands that remember when winters were colder and mead was stronger. Chickens mutter in their roosts. The snow settles quietly on every thatch, timber, and wishing stone. And tonight, for just these few hours, the old world holds its breath in the softness of sleep. No invaders at the gate, no harvest yet to lift. Only the fire gently remembering who it once was. So, my curious sleeper, let the imagined wool warm your limbs. Let the straw mattress cradle your clever thoughts, and let the cooling firelight carry your dreams into a time where warmth was rare, but never impossible. Sleep now, with a smile tucked gentle at the edge of your cheek, as history folds you into its softest, oldest blanket.